Hello everybody and welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival. The DIF is an online festival of ideas curated by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that asks the question, what if we could redesign everything? My name is Leo, and today, if you're interested in natural systems, the biocycle, agriculture, or even the growing global food dilemma, then you're in for a treat here today. In this session, I'm joined by Professor Weber Amaral, PhD. He has a PhD in evolutionary biology from Harvard University and is currently faculty at the School of Agronomy at the University of Sao Paulo, which is a pioneer university in the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's C100 network. Weber is joining us from Sao Paulo, as you'd probably expect. Weber, welcome to the DIF.
Thanks, Leo, and it's my pleasure to be with you all.
Great. And before we jump in, Weber, I just wanted to remind everyone watching this live on the session page that you can post your comments and questions throughout using the forum chat function just below the window where this is being streamed from. And we very much encourage your questions, because at the end of this, we'll have a questions and answer section. But do post them throughout the whole session, and then I'll try and put them to Weber and quiz him. But yeah, keep them coming throughout the session, and I'll try my utmost to ask them to Weber at the end, and possibly even throughout if they're particularly good. So without any further ado, let's kick things off, Weber. So the title of the session is Feeding the World Through Circular and Regenerative Agriculture. And that title alone kind of conjures up some images and some questions in my head, and possibly in the minds of viewers watching this now. I think it's good to get a bit of clarity on what you actually mean by circular and regenerative agriculture, and how that differs from traditional, perhaps linear agriculture practices that have been common up to now.
Well, regenerative agriculture, it's a very broad definition of multiple farm systems. It is not about a technique, but a system that aims to regenerate topsoils, basically bring back the organic matter that we have been losing for decades, and therefore increasing soil biodiversity, which is very important to keep the soil health, improve water conservation in the ecosystem functions. At the same time, contributing to the production of food with reduced or minimal impacts on the environment. Its principles and practice include several of the current trend to reduce the inputs, and basically we could name a few: organic farming, agroecology, agroforestry, permaculture, and others that mimic nature's multiple functions. So regenerative agriculture and circular regenerative agriculture is the way of producing goods, especially food and services, in a much different way, and in a way that brings back life to the soils, which what matters in terms of productivity.
Great. And a couple of those examples that you gave, such as permaculture, I know those sort of practices and forms of agriculture have been around for quite a long time. Why have we moved away from such, as you say, regenerative practices that replenish the topsoil, that encourage biodiversity and encourage the retention of water and minerals? Why have we moved away from these sorts of practices towards more extractive forms and unregenerative forms?
I think there are several causes, but most of them is that we have been away from nature's principles for regeneration process in agriculture and nature. What do I mean by that? We tend to intensify agriculture by neglecting the importance of knowledge, of the system that engaged, the farmers are engaged. And then we basically take it for granted and then neglect that knowledge to emphasize the importance of the technologies. I'm not saying that technologies and other, let's say, sources of modernity could not be reconciled with the other systems. I think the way in which we'll be moving in the future should be a much more smarter way of doing agriculture, which would benefit from the progress, scientific progress that we've had in the past, with the this way of seeing agriculture as a system, not as the end per se. So we have to look at agriculture as a system, as a natural system that needs to be taken care of.
Mm. Great. Yeah, as opposed to more of a kind of a mechanistic view, you put something in, you take it out, and that's going to last forever. Actually, there are a lot of soil is a massively complex substance. It's the divergence of the convergence of the lithosphere, biosphere, atmosphere, and hydrosphere. And I think that's probably going to be a common theme throughout the next half an hour to 45 minutes in this session. I just wanted to pick apart a little bit the food aspect of this session. We've had a little introduction to regenerative agriculture. And the title of this session is indeed Feeding the World Through Circular and Regenerative Agriculture. I just wanted to ask, up to this point, there are 7 billion people in the world. Are we feeding the world at the moment, and how does that look moving forward?
Actually, we are feeding the world, but we're still facing around 110 million people that are undernourished. So this is a huge task for us, because it is not about just providing volumes. It is about providing food with quality. It is providing dietary basis for different groups of different populations that requires different demands for not only to provide calories, but to provide the quality of those calories. In a lot of countries, in a lot of regions, food, it is not about volume, it is about culture, it is about tradition, it is about diversity, it is about sharing genes from one community to another one, it is about traditional knowledge. So food, it is not about what we encounter in the supermarket. Food, it is about this entire broad spectrum of diversity.
Great. But how do we go about doing that? I mean, you said food is an intrinsically kind of cultural, it's a very localized issue. People from one location relative to another are going to have a completely different diet, and therefore are going to have completely different demands on the agricultural system that they're in. But how do we actually go about doing that in a regenerative way, in a way where we're not depleting the important 6 to 8 inches of topsoil that we rely for the vast majority of food in the world?
Well, it's not I would say your question is a very complex one, and I will try to take it into several pieces. The first one is to restore the production capacity of several sites or several regions that were in production, I would say, decades ago. And this is also a daunting task, because that takes time, that requires policies, requires technologies. And the other aspect is that we'll always have regions that will be with the food deficit. It's not that every single region in the world will be able to provide their needs. There will be always exchange of food. ideally, as you said, the best way for the environment and that encompasses the principles of circularity is that if we will be able to produce locally and consume locally, this will be the ideal situation. But not every single region will have enough, I would say, capacity to produce what they need. So we'll have to develop regions or to improve the capacity of some regions nearby, not far away, but nearby, to supply with the minimum, I would say, transportation, logistics, and with the minimum impacts, especially in terms of greenhouse gases emission. Because when we transport food from miles and miles away or thousands of miles away, we are also create another problem. So the idea is to think in a production system that takes into account the landscape, the region, and not about just a plot or just a unit of production itself. So we have to move our lenses from a narrow perspective of a single crop or a single plot of land, and to start looking at watersheds, start looking at the functions of these landscapes. So therefore, the system will be much more resilient. It is not a simple way of thinking, but that requires a change in the mindset. On the other hand, I would say that farmers are doing, I would say, the best as, most of them are doing the best as they can to produce, because we're expecting a lot from them, because we expect them to produce food with quality, the quantity, providing environmental services, conservation of water, conservation of biodiversity. So it's a lot on their, let's say, baskets. So we need to realize that, because it's not a simple thing, because we're talking about agriculture that most of the parts of the world are rain-fed agriculture. They're not irrigated. So, and these guys are facing climate change. They're facing new dynamics of pests and diseases. These guys are facing increase on inputs, cost of fossil fuels. So it's a lot for them to make a decision. So, and to take into account. So we have to understand these challenges, and we as customers, we need to value their efforts. We need to take into account. We as a population are moving towards the city. We tend to be away and far away from the reality of what is happening in rural areas. We have no idea what is happening there, and we take it for granted. It is like a miracle when we transport vegetables or fruits, fresh fruits, and we want them in our supermarket with a minimum impact. They need to be beautiful. They need to be perfect. We need to change also our attitudes.
Yeah. So you touch upon attitudinal change, but I guess part of that, trying to understand or allowing farmers to have the resources to better understand and have better practices that are more regenerative. That will require quite a lot of perhaps infrastructure, perhaps community-based sharing of ideas between farmers. And what about the role of policy here? But like, in order to help them, I mean, here in the UK, the price of milk is cheaper than the price of
a liter water.
Exactly. So what kind of levers can be pulled upon in order for that to become more fair for the consumers, to pay a fair price, so that the farmers do have the resources to invest in the future and not just think year on year about short-term yields?
Yeah, exactly. This is a great challenge, is to have the enablers, and policies are instrumental in this. We're not talking about subsidies, but about rewards. Talking about rewarding farmers, rewarding producers that could taking care of their water, their resources. And there are several already policies in place that would say gives an incentive to farmers to conserve watersheds. farmers that will do better for biodiversity. But then in the end, what we've seen in different parts of the world, in Brazil particularly, is that farmers that take care of their soils are much better off in terms of reducing the consumption of inputs, reduction of water loss, and therefore contributing to their own productivity. In the end, we'll be doing good for the farmers and doing good for the customers. I will share some of slides, some numbers that illustrates a little bit about the challenges that we're facing when tackling some of these issues. One of the issues that we have to look is the area available for agriculture. What we see in this on this chart here is that most of areas that are, if you see here, in darker blue, are areas that the percentage of land area for agriculture is almost minimum. But these areas are either too cold or too hot when we're talking about desert areas in Africa or areas that are too cold. And the lighter blue, especially the ones very light blue, are areas where are under severe stress or under, let's say, severe competition of land use, especially in Southeast Asia, as you see, particularly in India, some areas in South Africa, which are stressed in terms of land use. Therefore, we are using particularly more than 50% of the total area with agriculture. But there are areas that we could still improve the use of actually areas that were converted into agriculture. Let me explain this figure now. This is a figure about the global land area used for agriculture. As you see, from 1961 until 1996, we see almost an exponential trend in use of land available for agriculture. That has been causing a lot of criticism, especially in terms of greenhouse gases emission, because we have been replacing or changing land use. But as you see, from 2000 until 2011, we see a sort of a stable curve that is showing that the land used in agriculture has been very stable. What does it mean? It means that agriculture productivity is taking care of the production. It is contributing to supply food without taking additional pieces of land. So this is very important, is to what extent we could contribute with increased productivity through regenerative agriculture systems. This is very, very important.
Right, and so you mentioned on that graph, it showed it quite nicely that there's kind of there's a plateau of the amount of land used, but at the same time, I assume that the amount of the yields in agriculture has increased in that time to meet the needs of an exponentially increasing global population. And I was wondering what the main driver is. What the main driver of that was? Is that better efficiency of farming techniques and equipment, or is that just the overuse of substances like fertilizer, pesticides? What would you put it down to?
Well, we cannot neglect the importance of the new technologies in agriculture development. We cannot be naive, because we have to be very, I would say, precise and providing, I would say, basically the acknowledging the roles that technologies, multiple technological systems that are used in agriculture had contributed to productivity. But the problem is not about the use of fertilizers. It's not about the use of machines. It's how we are using them. can we do differently? Can we improve? Can we design new fertilizers? Can we have organic fertilizers? Can we have fertilizers that will be encapsulated, that will be reducing their loss or their volatility because they're exposed into sun, they're going through with the water? Can we minimize these losses? Because the problem, it is not that we cannot do agriculture without without a proper knowledge of what is happening in that system. Mm-hmm. So that means that we need to take care of nutrient balance, we need to take care of water demands, we need to take care of understanding of the dynamics of pests and diseases. And this is why some systems like integrated pest and disease management, integrated pest and disease management needs to take care of it. I mean, it's not about spraying a product without knowing what is happening on the field. It is about integrating these multiple options. And therefore, agriculture would be much more efficient on the use of the resources. Back to your first question, we have been away from natural systems because we thought that probably intensification was the solution. What we're proposing here, it is not about intensification. What we're proposing, it is about intense diversification, which we could diversify the use of multiple crops in the same area, like agroforestry systems with the technology that we learn from other agriculture systems, and also to take care of, for example, of understanding what are the challenges in the future, especially in terms of water use. I think water will be a critical issue, has been already a critical issue for agricultural development, and this will be a major challenge. The other aspect that had contributed to agricultural productivity has been genetic breeding or genetic improvements of multiple crops. I'm not talking about technologies that uses or utilize the transgenes or are using genetic engineering technologies. We're talking about classic breeding programs that have been conducted by highly capable plant breeders throughout the world. Throughout the centuries, men have been breeding and moving genetic materials and increasing in selection of these materials for their purpose. So there is still a lot of room to go, to move towards local races, local diversity that is very fundamental to a more resilient agriculture system.
Yeah, and you mentioned genetic modification, and there has been a lot of media hype around GMs or GMOs, and what you just articulated was a good point, that they're not, genetic modification doesn't mean editing of the nuclei of cells. It means selective breeding to make individual plants, or in the case of cattle, breeding cows so that they have a greater yield per unit, and that's quite an important distinction. And that level of trying to communicate what technological advancements, like, not really a technological advancement, but what GMOs actually are, then you have a degree of societal trust with farmers. And I think that's kind of diverged a little bit. And you mentioned earlier that there is a disparity between people living in cities and people living in urban areas, that by 2050, 80% of people will be living in urban areas. So I think that level of communication between the rural and urban communities is an important one to bear in mind moving forward, and taking into account a lot of the issues like water scarcity, drought, and as we know with climate change, places that experience a lot of rainfall are going to experience more and more, and that's going to have soil saturation issues, and then areas that are prone to drought are going to experience really severe droughts going forward.
Exactly. Look at this number from FAO. This number shows areas or percentage of total agricultural land that is under irrigation. As you see, very dark blue, there is no irrigation, whereas light blue is areas that uses more water. You see in US and you see in some other places. But this figure will change by 2050 because we'll need to be much more wiser on the water use. Irrigation or water for irrigation will increase the demand for water in the systems. Look at the picture of Brazil. It's very minimum. It is almost less than 5%. The figure doesn't include Brazil, unfortunately, in that one. The data is missing. But I could say that agriculture systems in Brazil uses less than 5%. Less than 5% of total agriculture system in Brazil uses irrigation. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to increase. Definitely will increase because, as you said, climate change, changes in water patterns, and agriculture depends on water. Mm-hmm. The problem is, it's not that we're taking potable water. Agriculture is taking rain-fed water so far. But what we need to do is to keep the water in the watersheds, is to keep the quality. And therefore, back to my first, let's say, statement, to do that, you have to have a very solid soil system that is able to retain water and to get this water and keep this water off the runoff. So if we reduce superficial runoff, which is losing all the nutrients, losing the water, increasing the velocity, causing major floods, that is a problem. So we need to work on very old concepts of soil conservation and keeping the vegetation and keeping the soil protected. This is a system, a knowledge that we have been disseminating for a century, but we need to bring it back. So this is why farmers are implementing what we call minimum tillage or minimum cultivation system, not to overexpose the soil to heat, to water, and to protect and keep biomass in the soil as much as possible. This is very, very important, especially in tropical soils that are highly, I would say, exposed to intemperism, to highly exposed to temperature, water. So keep the biomass, keep the organic matter in the soil. Soil is the key. If I could synthesize most of what we are talking so far now, it is about let's protect the soils. Soils are the fundamental piece on this productivity equation.
Great. Well, so yeah, we have touched upon it a little bit earlier about how important soil is. But going back to what you just mentioned, the minimum conservation system that farmers are increasingly looking at the soil and trying to make sure that the soil isn't losing biomass. Is that something that's becoming more and more prevalent? And have you got examples of this?
Oh yes, there are several examples in different parts of the world. In the tropics, there are examples of systems that protects the soil in Peru, in Bolivia, in Brazil, as we are doing a lot of minimum tillage practice, and I would say around 30% of total, or around 40% of our management systems are minimum tillage. Examples from Canada, US, Europe, and France. So this is a trend that is here and is not going to shift. This is an important one, to keep the soil as intact as possible. So you have all the microbiodiversity there. You have all the necessary elements to keep the soil structure as intact as possible. Therefore, by doing this, we reduce, I would say, even greenhouse gases emission. As you recall, this week we have the COP21 in Bonn, and there are a lot of issues that are touching upon the contribution of agriculture towards reducing greenhouse gas emission and mitigating the consequences of climate change. Agriculture has this dual role. It emits greenhouse gases, but we need to reduce these emissions, but also has a huge potential to mitigate and absorb CO2 in a higher rate. And as long as we see this as a natural system that releases and uptakes CO2, our balance needs to be much more towards keeping the CO2, keeping methane, keeping all the greenhouse gases on the soil, on the system as much as possible, or fix them into the biomass, into long-term, I would say, biomass storage. So therefore, agriculture has this also role of creating opportunities for mitigation of greenhouse gases.
And a lot of that is tied into the fact that you did briefly mention that in order to have agricultural land, you must get rid of predominantly forest areas, which themselves are massive sinks for CO2. And seeing that decline, making sure that deforestation is reduced, and the land that is already there for pasture and for agriculture, that the soil is kept intact. And you mentioned the soil microbes there and soil diversity. I was just wondering if you could kind of elaborate on that a little bit. I'm sure many people are aware that there are microbes in the soil, but kind of how important are those interactions, and why is diversity of the soil important?
It is, I would say, of crucial, the microbial fauna and in the soil and the flora, the interactions between them are responsible for changes, evolutionary changes that we see in tropical forests. For example, some of the scientists are associating the degree and the quality and the biodiversity of some systems because of microfauna. In addition, this microfauna could provide nutrients throughout the interactions with the root systems of these plants. So in addition to create and making nutrients more available to them, it is like a channel of capturing some of these nutrients and making them available to a plant or to multiple crops in the same system. And therefore, when we do or either intercropping or agroforestry system or integrated, would say, annual crops, pastoral land with trees, we create the conditions, the conditions for this diversity to also to be enriched. What people complain about having a single crop, a monoculture, is that a monoculture usually doesn't increase or doesn't enable the microfauna to be diverse by its own nature of being a monoculture. What farmers are doing to mitigate this problem is to have crop rotations. So in one season you use one crop, another season you use another crop, usually to, for example, to support the uptake of nitrogen, for example, through biological uptake of nitrogen without the need to use external fertilizers. So again, it's about knowledge systems and integration of these knowledge systems into a process of making farmers aware of the importance of this. And now, as a faculty here at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, I have to say that there is a lot of willingness of students to learn about this, and it is our role to provide them to play as an architecture of change, an architecture of choice, as Richard Tyler said. We need to provide farmers a choice. We need to provide our students a choice of these multiple choices of solutions. Again, there is no panacea for having a production system that is only in one way or the other way. I think the crucial for us to understand that the future of agriculture relies on reconciling or understanding the multiple aptitudes of the regions, the soils, how we make decisions about using one crop or another crop, or combining these crops, and also to take them into account market forces that will be requiring, I would say, as you said in the beginning, some enabling conditions for them to be rewarded when they do good things for the landscape. So, or when you have an overproduction of that specific crop. So how can these guys benefit for contributing to food security, as well as the other services that we are expecting that farmers should take care for us?
Yeah, there's not a lot of incentive, and first and foremost, I want to say thank you to a few people that are popping questions in. I am taking note, and we'll get to the more interactive part of the session in a little while. You just mentioned that. I'm sorry, I got distracted by the question. Could you repeat that final point? Oh, I've just remembered. You've just mentioned that the farmers should be thinking about this, the broader services that their land and their soil and their crops are supplying for us and for us as a species. That at the moment, why should they actually care about these grander issues if it's not going to affect their profits and their yields? Like, how is climate change? Say, I know a couple of farmers that are here on the Isle of Wight, but I'm sure that there isn't an incentive for them to take into account carbon sequestration in their soil.
Well, yeah, usually farmers are very pragmatic people, because they need to cope with uncertainties, they need to cope with say market failures. They're very pragmatic. I'm not saying that they should take care of our other systems, especially in terms of reducing greenhouse gases, being in charge of doing all these things. What I'm saying is that we need to have in mind and balance all these externalities, all these benefits that either a farmer might bring us or might not when they decide for one crop or one practice or another. It is not a simple equation to design proper incentives, because usually that creates market barriers or creates problems, especially on global trade agreements. What I'm saying is that farmers, at the first, I would say, place, they need to take care of their crop. But by taking care of their crop, it means that they have to look at productivity. And if they have a long-term vision, productivity, it is a matter of doing all these things together. They will see that a short lens brings them a short span of productivity, not long-term productivity gains. This is a very subtle, I would say, change. That, of course, if this year he's making a lot of money, but they're causing a lot of, let's say, soil loss, use of intense inputs. So even though they're making money this year, in the next 10 years, they have to look ahead and say, what will look like my system in 10, 15 years?
Mm-hmm.
Another issue that I have to raise here today, it is important that farmer succession, or who will be replacing them, this is a global issue. Who would like to be the farmers of the future? Who will be producing our food? It is not that we'll have biofabrics or bioplants or producing, I would say, artificial food. It's not a food that doesn't have a taste, a food that is not well prepared. As I said in the beginning, food is part of our cultural heritage. We'll still need farmers to play an important role.
What about urban agriculture? I know that a lot of people are into the idea that, I mean, we've mentioned kind of the decentralization of food production in urban areas. What about aquaculture and the idea of vertical farming? Is that not going to save us?
Again, it is part of this broader equation. There is no saviors on this. There's no.
I think I've just lost Weber a little bit there. I'll leave it a couple of minutes, and hopefully he can come back on again. Sorry about this, everybody. We were just about to transition on to the question and answer. Unfortunately, that would be pretty boring if it was just me. So I will stay online for a little while. How about if I just read off a couple of the questions that you guys have put on, put in onto the session page, and I actually wanted to highlight a session that's coming up in just over 15 minutes or so here at the DIF. Let me just have a look at my notes here. In 15 minutes, we're kind of sticking onto the theme of food and the question of feeding the world in a regenerative way. I know I mentioned aquaculture and vertical farming there, and kind of on that idea stream, we've got a startup called Algama who will be discussing microalgae as a unique and potentially abundant superfood that could be one such innovation that can help us feed the world, feed the 9 billion mouths that we're going to have by 2050, and 80% of which are going to be living in cities. So that's in 50 minutes. I think Weber's just joined us again, or maybe perhaps we've just lost his video feed. I'm not entirely certain. Hopefully he can come back, because that was really interesting stuff, and we've still got the Q&A, and I don't want these questions to go to waste, and I'm not going to answer them myself. And also highlighting another session tomorrow, actually. This isn't the only session from the University of Sao Paulo. Web is also going to feature in this one. I do understand. I haven't actually seen it yet, but the University of Sao Paulo are going to be releasing a video at the DIF tomorrow that's highlighting the work that USP are doing around empowering society and different forms of society to transition towards a circular economy. So look out for that in the schedule at 5 p.m. UK time. That's titled, aptly named, the University of Sao Paulo, Empowering Society Towards a Circular Economy. And if you want to explore food and farming at the DIF more broadly, if you go onto the schedule at thinkdiff.co, we've actually got a food and farming tag there that if you click on, there's a whole host of sessions around the theme. Some that have already happened, some that are going to come up. And remember, if you've missed any of those sessions or other sessions from a variety of different topics, then you can check those out at thinkdiff.co on the schedule, and you can watch any that you've missed on due to the catch-up feature. And if that wasn't enough, you can always explore the playlists that we have that are new to the DIF this year. We have the Circular Economy playlist, which is every day we're releasing, or we're highlighting really good sessions that we think that you would love around the circular economy if you want to learn more, and I can't see why you wouldn't. And we've also got playlists around the three main themes: the age of automation, 21st economics, and circular design. I'm still holding up hope that Weber's going to join us again. I think he has just dropped out. What I'll do is I'll read out a couple of the questions as if he was here, just so that you know what we've got lined up when he does return. So Rachel asks, how global is our food system, and whether or not we need to talk about it as one large interconnected system or lots of individual systems with a myriad of separate crops and flows of goods. I think that I may ask that first and foremost, because I'm really interested to hear what Weber will say. And I've got a couple more lined up there, but assuming that Weber's going to come back, and I really hope he does, and I'm sure you really hope he does as well, do you take this opportunity to ask some questions in the comments section. We've also got a couple here. Ricky at AgTech asks, well, it's quite a long one here, but he's curious to hear some specific examples of agriculture enterprises shifting to a more regenerative system. I know of one example in Brazil that was part of the DIF conference a few years back. That's Leontino Balboa's sugarcane farm, which has seen his record-breaking, unprecedented growth and yields by looking at the soil and taking care of the soil with things like making sure that they're not compressing the soil too much. And his idea that if you look after the soil, then you look after your own pocket, which is a really, really poignant message. I'm not 100% sure if it's going to come back, but that's actually not the end of that question. So Leontino Balboa, Ricky goes on to say that his story has now been out there for a few years. And Ricky's asking whether or not people are banging on the door asking for help. And the question that he's really getting at is, we now know that this system of farming makes more sense for all stakeholders. How do we engage change at a more rapid pace? Which would be... oh, Weber, you're back.
Yes, I'm back. I'm sorry, guys.
Great. So you've saved the audience from my spiels and me talking to myself. Yes. But I highlighted a couple of sessions that were coming up, including the video that I think you're going to be starring in,
sure.
the University of Sao Paulo one, which is going to be a great one.
I'm sorry, guys. I planned this properly with Leo, but something happened here. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I think
we're
prepared for everything. So if we try and get back on track, I know that we were talking about something before you left. Do you remember what it was? If we can finish that up quickly before getting on to Q&A.
Yeah, I asked, or I was saying that in the connection between the cities and rural areas is fundamental, as most of the people would say by 2050, around 75% of the population will be urban population. And cities are major powerhouses for consumption of energy, generating waste, use of water. So we need to design frameworks that will make the necessary connections between rural areas and the cities and vice versa. Therefore, making the links between the biological systems and the urban systems that today are decoupled. We need to couple them. We need to make sure that there is a connection between these two systems. And this is very important, because we cannot take it for granted that the systems that we're talking about, it is an integration of systems. It is not about the rural versus cities. It is about how we use the landscape in a much wiser way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and kind of on that point, there was a good question that that Rachel asked. I'm not sure where from here, but Rachel asks, how global is our food system? Do we need to talk about it as one large interconnected system? I think you've just answered that question. Or do we treat it as lots of individual systems with a myriad of separate crops and flows of goods?
That is a very good question. There are global food systems, which are, would say, we could count in our hands and are major on around 10 major crops. These are global food systems or value chains that are of global nature. But most of these 10 major crops or food systems are not the ones that are present in our daily, I would say, meals. They're global, but not necessarily the best tasteful or that provides diversity that we want in our tables. Therefore, we have a myriad of small connections, of multiple networks, of other local food chains. And this is and these are as important as the other ones that moves a lot of dollars around. I'm talking about the other food systems that are important for local jobs, that are important for diversity of the food system, that are especially important for dietary diversity. Dietary diversity, it is another issue, because food, I would say, food systems, it is not about, again, volume, it is about volume, quality, and the cultural aspects. And as you know, the population is aging, which means that we need to take care of their specific needs. As we are aging the population, we are not only increasing the population, we're increasing the demand for more calories, and we need to have a different diets as the people are moving into a different, they're getting older, living longer, and we want to have healthier foods. Foods in general are a crucial step in making our choices about our health in the future. It is now and will continue to be in the future. A good diet saves us a lot of money because we saved on medicine, we saved on a lot of pain as we are getting old.
Yeah, and in terms of that, in terms of a diet and making sure you have not just a good level of calories and good level of proteins and specific vitamins, you briefly mentioned the impact that your diet has in context to the current agricultural system. Now, again, I'm going to try and bring this out of kind of what's going on in the media right now and what the majority of a good chunk of the population are feeling at the moment, is that if you just switch to a vegan diet, that would just, if everybody did that, then we'd be much better off. The amount of carbon sequestration going on in the soils globally would increase, the water retention, not mentioning the animal cruelty side of it. But if everybody turned into vegans, would that not solve it for you?
Well, it's part of the equation. I'm not sure if everybody would like to turn vegan.
No,
but anyway, I would say there's a trend that to be, I would say, closer to vegan as possible. That is probably it's a consumer's choice. But there's nothing wrong about eating protein, animal protein. It is about your choice. But what it counts, what it matters, is how we are making those animal proteins. It is not about vegans versus guys that are taking a steak on the restaurant. It is about how we integrate them and to have a much more, I would say, circular and sustainable long-run food production systems that will, let's say, integrate these multiple options and provide the options. The problem is the lack of options. We need to provide options to all of us. Yeah.
Yeah, very good point. Well answered. I just wanted to get onto. I'm very cautious of time. We lost a couple of minutes with you where you wandered off somewhere. But there's a good question here on the session page, which is from Ricky in AgTech, and I apologize to everyone that's having to hear me repeat this question, but this is directly directed towards you, Weber. He says, and I quote, "I'm curious to hear some specific examples of agriculture enterprises shifting to a more regenerative system. I know one example in Brazil that was part of the DIF, and that was Leontino Balboa and the Balboa Group. His story has been out for a few years now, and it is a great story. If anybody hasn't seen it, I'll go onto the DIF YouTube channel and check that out. So great, it's a great 50-minute video.
Sure.
Ricky asks, are people banging on the door asking for help from people like Leontino? And because we know now that this system of farming, this more regenerative model of farming makes more sense for all stakeholders, how do we enact change at a more rapid pace? So there's kind of two questions there.
Sure, it's a great question. I would say that there are several good examples out there. I will name a few, but the other aspect is that we are very bad on the storytelling of these examples. We need to make sure that these stories are disseminated. Leontino Balbo's example with the organic sugar production, it is a good one. It's a large scale. It proves that he could regenerate the soils. He could produce sugarcane in large fields. But there are other examples of other farmers in different parts of Brazil. And I will invite you guys to also to attend our first Brazilian seminar on circular economy for agriculture that will take place November 24th. We'll be dealing and bringing all these examples of farmers in different scales and different situations. It is not only about being organic, as the case of Leontino, but it's about restoring the capacity of soils to produce. There are several interesting examples of one state of Brazil, which is in the south of Brazil. It's called Santa Catarina State. It's a small state which is land tenure has been very well defined for, let's say, more than 60 years. A lot of these communities were immigrants from Italy and other places. And they struggled a lot to identify a production system that they were imposed to them or were available to them. But during the last 40 years, they moved into a much more regenerative agriculture system. And they are able now to produce in lands which were strangled, lands, especially lands that were passing through severe floods, lands that have been not suitable for agriculture anymore. So they started bring back the biomass. The first step was bring back vegetation, bring back the organic matter to the soil. And then little by little, but that it took, I would say, almost 10 years for them to going back into a production system. It is not, again, it's not a panacea. It is not something that you click your fingers and you do it. That requires a lot of understanding of the limitations of your system. So this is one example of several farmers community, and they are not managing their own plot. The major changes that they're managing watersheds. So the unit of management changed from their own perspective of private property to a much more landscape management system.
Right.
There are several ones, and one example that I will share also, it is about an example in the Amazon, in Brazilian Amazon. So I share an example from the south of Brazil. I'm sharing another one, and Leontino Balbo is from the southeast of Brazil, and another example from the south of, from the north of Brazil, in the state of Pará. State of Pará is the second largest state in Brazil, and has been under severe scrutiny because of deforestation, high deforestation rates. It is probably the state that had suffered the most recently in the last 30 years because of deforestation. But now with the policies in place and a lot of pressure from social groups, NGOs, even farmers, even customers, they cannot produce on new deforested area. There is specific policies that does not allow them to cut the forest anymore. But on these areas that are highly degraded areas, we are supporting local farmers to diversify their production system, to restore riparian corridors that are along watersheds, bring back acai berries, which are a super berry that you are consuming probably in London, in other places in the US. It's a very dark berry that is very good on anthocyanins. So we started with the riparian corridors and going up into the terra firme ecosystem, which is the highlands. So we have to start from the bottom, from the watershed, from the riparian corridors and going up. And the first critical element was to bring back these palm trees. So these palm trees that are dispersed by large animals, by fish. So we are restoring the first unit of that system from the margins of these watersheds and going back upland. Yeah. So again, there are several examples, and we need to describe, and I urge you guys that are listening to me, if you would like to share your stories, and we need to have good stories to say that this is good for agriculture, is good for food production, is good also for the business, because we have to understand that to be regenerative by definition, we need to bring back the properties, but also it needs to make sense economically.
Great. And so you mentioned that that there was a conference on the 24th of November where you're going to be speaking and giving more examples. Is that something that people can attend, or is there something?
Yes. Well, it will be live. I will share with you guys the link. This is the first Brazilian seminar on circular agriculture. I will not say much. I will just be the facilitator. But it's better to listen to the guys that are making the stories, not myself.
Absolutely. Is that just in person, or is there going to be a recording of that online?
Yeah, they will be recorded and also be live.
Great.
So it'll be a pleasure. Yeah.
Cool. So I think perhaps it would be great to put the link to any information online into the comments section, where we've had a couple of questions through from the audience.
Sure.
Great. Well, on the subject of that, I just want to say thank you to the audience for sticking with us with a minor technical hitch there, and thank you, Weber, as well. That was really, really interesting. We managed to cover quite a lot of ground. Food isn't a small topic; it's a very important one. And regenerative agriculture, I think, as you mentioned, there are some really great examples, and you're going to point us into the direction of more examples of this happening. So thank you very much, Weber, for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Leo, and thanks for your help and your good facilitation role. It has been a pleasure to be working with you today, and I hope to see you soon.
Yes, likewise. Great. So I'll keep it a short wrap up, because I kind of wrapped up around about 20 minutes ago. But just a reminder that 5 minutes ago, you would have just missed the beginning of the session, but the session titled Microalgae, an untapped resource that will feed the future. And I'm sure Weber would say that it's not going to feed the future, but it's going to be part of the answer. Is that about right, Weber?
Yes, exactly. I think microalgae is also providing not only food, but also providing biofuels. There are multiple systems to intensification. But again, it's an intense diversification system that we need. We need to reconcile. Reconcile is the word to provide these multiple options. We have to provide a portfolio of options.
Great.
So, and microalgae is probably one of them.
Fantastic. Well, you've got a bit of context now, folks. Then go over to the Google Hangout that's just started 5 minutes ago and check that session out. And that's titled Microalgae, an untapped resource that will feed the future. Once again, And another reminder that we've got the second session from USP tomorrow, which is a pre-recorded video of Weber and his colleagues at USP describing how the University of Sao Paulo are empowering society towards a circular economy. And I think that's just about it for today. Just in case you've missed any sessions in the DIF so far, as I mentioned earlier, you can catch up any and all pre-recorded and live sessions. The live sessions are pre-recorded, are recorded and are there available to you for the duration of the DIF and for 1 month afterwards. And in terms of this session, Weber, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you very much for joining us here today. Until next time at the DIF. Goodbye.
Okay, bye.